Princess Stalvia sat alone in the grand but cold halls of the Zorvani palace. The glow of her bioluminescent skin was faint, a reminder of the defect that had marked her since birth. Among the Zorvani, strength and radiance were everything. A warrior's body, a sharp mind, and a commanding presence were the signs of a worthy heir. But Salvia had none of those. At least that was what the others believed. Born with a rare genetic condition, she was weaker than her kind. She could not run as fast. Her body lacked the powerful physique of her siblings, and her glow was dim. To the Zorvani, she was a failure. Even though she had spent years studying diplomacy, warfare, and strategy, none of it mattered. She was still the crippled princess, a burden to the empire. Her father, Emperor Vorkan, had long given up on her. He did not hate her, but he saw no future for her. She was kept out of important affairs, hidden away like a forgotten relic. Her siblings trained to become future leaders, while she was left in the shadows, ignored by her people. And now, as the empire prepared for an important diplomatic meeting with the humans, she knew she would be left out once again. But fate had other plans. The arrival of the humans was the talk of the empire. It was the first time their kind had come to Zorvani Prime in an official capacity. Though their technology was impressive, they were physically weaker than the Zorvani. Many nobles saw them as nothing more than an amusing curiosity, creatures too small and fragile to be taken seriously. Among them was Captain Daniel Cross, a diplomat chosen to represent humanity. He was not a warrior by Zorvani standards, but there was something different about him. Unlike the others, he did not shrink under the watchful eyes of the towering Zorvani nobles. He moved with quiet confidence, his sharp eyes observing everything around him. He was here to negotiate trade agreements, military cooperation, and cultural exchange. But he was also here for something else. As the humans were led through the Grand Palace, Cross noticed a figure standing apart from the others. A Zorvani woman with a softer presence, her glow dimmer than the rest. She was not introduced. No one spoke to her. She seemed out of place. Curious, Cross approached her. "You don't seem very interested in the meeting," he said casually. Zalvia turned, surprised that anyone had addressed her directly, let alone a human. She had seen his kind before in reports, but this was the first time she had spoken to one. He was smaller than a Zorvani male, his features different, but his eyes held something unfamiliar. He was looking at her, really looking at her, not with pity or scorn, but with interest. "I am not part of the discussions," she replied simply. "Why not?" She hesitated. "Because I am unimportant." Cross raised an eyebrow. He had read about Zorvani culture before arriving. They valued strength above all else. A ruler had to be powerful, and those who were weak were pushed aside. But he could see something the others missed. Zalvia's sharp mind, the way she observed everything in the room, the way her voice carried a quiet confidence despite her words. "I find it hard to believe," he said. Zalvia was taken aback. No one had ever doubted her insignificance before. Before she could respond, the booming voice of one of the nobles interrupted them. "Human, you waste your time." It was Lord Zorkel, a high-ranking official. He sneered at Salvia, his bioluminescence glowing brightly to show his strength. "This one is a failure. No warrior would claim her, and no noble would stand beside her." Zalvia felt the familiar sting of humiliation. She had heard these words all her life. But then something unexpected happened. Cross turned to the noble and, with an amused smile, said, "That's funny. Where I come from, intelligence is more valuable than brute strength. And from what I've seen, she's the most interesting person in this room." A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd. A human, one of the so-called weaker species, had dared to speak in favor of the crippled princess. Some found it amusing. Others found it offensive. But Zalvia, for the first time in years, she felt something other than shame, interest. As the banquet continued, Cross did not leave her side. He asked her about Zorvani history, about their culture, about their traditions, and for the first time, someone listened to her words as if they mattered. But the nobles were not pleased. Emperor Vorkon watched in silence, his expression unreadable. Some of his advisors whispered about the humans' foolishness. Others saw an opportunity. Perhaps the humans, with their strange ways, could be useful allies. But one thing was certain. Dangle Cross had just changed the course of Zalvia's life forever. And soon, the entire empire would know it. The grand banquet hall of the Zorveni Palace was alive with light and sound. Glowing figures of powerful nobles moved with grace, their conversations filled with pride and arrogance. Servants carried golden trays of exotic food, while music from strange alien instruments echoed through the air. The Zorveni elite laughed, discussed politics, and boasted about their achievements. But in one corner of the hall, Princess Salvia sat in silence. She had never been part of these grand events. She was always present, but never truly included. Tonight was no different. Except for one thing. A human sat beside her. Captain Dangle Cross was not like the other diplomats she had seen before. While the other humans cautiously followed Zorveni traditions, afraid of offending their hosts, Cross acted differently. He was respectful, but not fearful. He spoke with confidence, his sharp eyes observing everything. And when he looked at Salvia, it was not with pity, but with genuine curiosity. "You are not like the others," Salvia said softly. Cross smiled, taking the sip of his drink. "And you are not like the others either." She lowered her gaze. "That is not a good thing in my society." Cross leaned forward slightly. "Maybe your society is wrong." Salvia's bioluminescent markings flickered with surprise. No one had ever said that to her before. The Zorveni believed their traditions were absolute. Strength was everything. Perfection was the key to power. Those who did not meet the standard were forgotten. But now, this human, a being from another world, was questioning everything she had been told. Before she could respond, a loud voice interrupted them. "You waste your time, human." Lord Zorkel, a high-ranking noble, approached with a smirk. His body was tall and muscular, his glow bright with confidence. Other nobles followed, their expressions amused. "This one is unworthy," Zorkel continued, gesturing toward Salvia. "No Zorveni male would claim her. No warrior would fight for her. What could she possibly offer you?" Salvia's heart sank. She had heard these words before. She had lived with them all her life. Cross, however, remained calm. He set down his drink and looked directly at the noble. "That's funny," he said, his voice even. "Where I come from, intelligence and kindness matter more than just physical strength, and from what I've seen, she's the most impressive person in this room." The nobles exchanged shocked glances. A human, a weaker species, was speaking against Zorveni tradition. Some scoffed, others whispered. Salvia herself could not believe what she was hearing. Zorkel let out a deep, rumbling laugh. "You must be joking. Are all humans this foolish? Do you not understand how our world works?" Cross smiled, but there was a sharpness in his eyes. "I understand perfectly. I just don't agree." Silence fell over the group. For the first time in her life, Salvia saw a noble struggling to find a response. Cross had challenged him in a way no one else ever had. Not with brute strength, but with words. Zorkel scoffed. "You are an outsider. Your words mean nothing here." Cross shrugged. "Then why are you so bothered by them?" The noble's glow flickered for a moment, a sign of frustration. But before he could speak again, another voice cut through the tension. "Enough." All eyes turned toward the emperor himself. Vorkon, ruler of the Zorveni Empire, sat upon his high throne, watching the scene unfold. His face was unreadable, but his presence was powerful. Even the proudest nobles lowered their heads in respect. He studied Cross for a long moment before speaking. "Human," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "You defend my daughter as if she has value. Do you truly believe she does?" Salvia held her breath. This was the moment. If Cross backed down now, it would prove what the nobles had always said. She was worthless. But Cross did not hesitate. "Yes," he said firmly. "I do." Gasps filled the hall. No one had ever spoken of Salvia in such a way. The Emperor's eyes narrowed. "Then tell me, human, what will you do about it?" Cross turned to Salvia. There was no hesitation, no doubt in his expression. Then, to the shock of the entire court, he spoke the words that would change everything. "If no one else sees her worth, then they don't deserve her." He took a deep breath, and then, with complete sincerity, he asked, "Princess Salvia, will you mate with me?" The room fell into complete silence. Salvia's entire world stopped. The nobles stared in disbelief. The Emperor's face remained unreadable. Even the human diplomats were stunned. No Zorvani had ever proposed to her before. Not once in her entire life had anyone considered her as a worthy mate. And now, here was a human, an outsider, offering her what her own people had denied her. Her bioluminescent glow flickered wildly as she struggled to process the moment. The Emperor slowly stood. "You dare make such a claim in my court?" Cross met his gaze without fear. "Yes, I do." Whispers spread through the hall like wildfire. Some called it madness. Others saw it as an insult. But there were a few, just a few, who saw something else. Change. For the first time in Zorvani history, a human had challenged tradition. And for the first time in her life, Princess Salvia was not invisible. She was at the center of it all. And she had a choice to make. The silence in the banquet hall felt heavier than a starship's gravity field. Hundreds of glowing Zorvani eyes locked onto Captain Daniel Cross, the human diplomat who had just proposed to Princess Salvia. The air itself seemed to freeze, as if the entire palace was struggling to process his words. Salvia sat still, her bioluminescent patterns flickering in confusion. No one had ever asked for her. No Zorvani male had ever considered her worthy. And now, an outsider, a human, had done what no one else dared. The Emperor's gaze was sharp, his golden glow burning with unreadable emotions. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and controlled. "You misunderstand our ways, human. A mating proposal is not a simple request. It is a claim, a challenge. If you wish to stand beside a Zorvani princess, you must prove yourself worthy." Cross didn't hesitate. "Then I will prove it." Gasps echoed through the hall. Some nobles laughed, amused by the human's boldness. Others whispered among themselves, sensing something unusual in this moment. No human had ever stood against Zorvani tradition. No outsider had ever challenged the Empire's way of life. Lord Zorkel, the noble who had mocked Salvia earlier, stepped forward with a sneer. A human, proving himself worthy. Ridiculous. He turned to the Emperor, his tone dripping with contempt. "Your Majesty, this is an insult to our traditions. This creature should be punished for his arrogance." The Emperor did not look at Zorkel. Instead, he kept his gaze on Cross. "You truly wish to stand by her side?" Cross nodded. "I do." Salvia's breath caught in her throat. He had no reason to do this. No reason to risk himself for her. And yet here he was. Unshaken, determined. The Emperor's expression remained unreadable. Then he slowly raised a hand. "If that is your wish," he said, "then you will face the trial of mates." The hall erupted into noise. Nobles shouted in surprise, while others grinned in amusement. The trial of mates was a sacred Zorvani tradition, an ancient test of strength, intelligence, and resilience. Any noble seeking a mate from the royal family had to complete the trials to prove they were worthy. But no outsider had ever attempted it. Salvia's heart pounded. The trial was brutal. Even Zorvani warriors struggled to pass. How could a human survive? Cross, however, did not back down. He simply met the Emperor's gaze and said, "Then tell me what I must do." The news spread across the Empire like wildfire. A human had proposed to the crippled princess. A weak, fragile outsider had challenged Zorvani tradition. Some laughed at the absurdity. Others were outraged, calling it an insult to their proud warrior race. But there were also those who watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen next. In the days that followed, Xalvia found herself in an unfamiliar position. Everywhere she went, people whispered her name. Nobles, servants, even common citizens spoke about her. For years, she had been ignored. Now, she was the center of attention, not for her weakness, but for the challenge that had been placed before her. She was not sure how to feel about it. Sitting in her private chambers, she thought about Cross's words. "I see you," not as a crippled princess, but as a person with a mind sharper than any here. No one had ever spoken to her like that. No one had ever treated her as if she mattered. A soft knock on the door pulled her from her thoughts. When it opened, she was not surprised to see Cross standing there. "You should not be here," she said, though her voice lacked the strength of conviction. Cross leaned against the doorway, arms crossed. "I figured you might want to yell at me for causing a political scandal." Xalvia gave a small, amused huff. "Do you understand what you have done? The trial of mates is not some simple challenge. You cold." She hesitated, unable to say the word. "Lose," Cross finished. "Yeah, I know." She looked away. "Then why? Why would you do this for me?" Cross took a step closer, his voice softer now. "Because I meant what I said. You're worth more than the way they treat you, and if no one else will fight for you, I will." Her bioluminescent patterns flickered, a silent display of her emotions. She had spent her entire life believing she was worthless, and now, standing before her was a human who was willing to fight for her, simply because he believed she was worth something. The thought was terrifying and thrilling. She looked at him, truly looked at him, and for the first time, she asked herself a question she had never dared to consider. What if he is right? The day of the trial arrived faster than expected. The grand arena, an ancient battleground where warriors had proven their strength for generations, was filled with thousands of spectators. Nobles, warriors, even members of the Emperor's inner council had gathered to witness the event. Cross stood in the center of the arena, his human frame looking small compared to the towering Zorvani around him. He wore simple combat gear, borrowed from the human embassy, and despite the obvious disadvantage, he did not look afraid. Xalvia stood in the royal balcony, watching with bated breath. The Emperor stepped forward, his voice echoing through the arena. "The trial of mates is a sacred test. If the human wishes to claim my daughter, he must prove his worth." He gestured toward the other end of the arena. A massive Zorvani warrior stepped forward, his bioluminescent patterns pulsing like fire. He was twice Cross's size, his muscles thick with years of combat training. The Emperor's gaze did not soften. "Let the trial begin." A deep drum echoed through the arena. The warrior lunged. Cross moved, and the battle for Xalvia's future had begun. The crowd roared as the massive Zorvani warrior charged at Cross, his glowing markings flaring with strength. The ground trembled under his powerful steps, and his sharp claws gleamed under the bright arena lights. Xalvia's heart pounded as she watched from the royal balcony. She had seen many battles before. She knew how brutal the trial of mates could be. But this was different. This was a human, a species weaker in physical strength, facing a warrior trained since birth. Cross, however, did not stand still. The warrior growled in frustration, turning around with a snarl. "You run like prey," he mocked. "Fight me properly." Cross smirked, breathing steadily. "You're big, strong, and slow. Why should I play by your rules?" The warrior roared in anger and lunged again. This time, Cross did not run. Instead, he sidestepped at the last second and struck, his fist connecting with the warrior's ribs. It wasn't enough to do major damage, but it was enough to make the Zorvani stumble. Another murmur ran through the crowd. The human had landed a hit. Xalvia felt a flicker of hope. He's not just fighting, he's thinking. She could see it now. Cross wasn't trying to overpower his opponent. That would be foolish. Instead, he was testing the warrior's movements, looking for weaknesses. The Zorvani warrior, however, was growing angrier by the second. With a furious snarl, he raised both arms high and slammed them down. Cross barely managed to dodge, rolling to the side as dust and sand exploded from the impact. Enough of these games. The warrior roared. Face me like a true fighter. Cross took a deep breath and straightened. All right, he said. Let's do this your way. The crowd fell silent as Cross raised his fists, not in fear, but in challenge. The warrior grinned, pleased that the human had finally decided to fight properly. He charged again, preparing to end the fight with one final blow. But Cross was ready. At the last second, he ducked and pivoted, using the warrior's own momentum against him. With a swift movement, he struck the warrior's leg, throwing him off balance. The massive Zorvani stumbled forward, and Cross delivered a solid punch to the back of his knee. The impossible happened. The warrior collapsed onto one knee. The entire arena gasped. Zalvia's hands clenched together. She had never seen anything like this before. A human, a supposedly weak species, had brought a Zorvani warrior to his knees. But Cross didn't stop there. Before the warrior could recover, Cross moved again. He leaped onto the warrior's back, wrapped his arm around the thick neck, and squeezed. A chokehold, a technique no Zorvani had ever considered using in battle. The warrior thrashed, trying to throw Cross off, but the human held on with an iron grip. The Zorvani's movements grew weaker, his struggles less powerful. The lack of oxygen was taking effect. The crowd watched in stunned silence. The warrior tried one last time to break free, but his body betrayed him. With a final shudder, his glowing markings dimmed, and he fell forward, unconscious. The silence that followed was deafening. Then, a single voice shouted, "The human has won." The arena exploded into noise. Some Zorvani cheered in excitement. Others were furious, calling it a dishonorable victory. But the truth was undeniable. Cross had defeated his opponent. Zalvia exhaled a breath she didn't realize she was holding. On the royal balcony, the emperor watched him with unreadable eyes. His golden bioluminescence pulsed slowly, a sign of deep thought. "You have passed the first trial, human," the emperor announced, his voice echoing across the arena. But strength alone is not enough to stand beside a Zorvani royal. A true mate must also possess wisdom. A murmur ran through the crowd. The trial of mind was not a test of combat, but of intelligence, problem-solving, and strategy. Cross's lips quirked up in a half-smile. "Finally, a test that plays to my strengths." The emperor gestured, and a group of scholars stepped forward, carrying an ancient Zorvani puzzle. It was a large cube, its surface covered in glowing symbols that constantly shifted. This was the Maze of the Ancients, a challenge designed to test the minds of the most brilliant Zorvani leaders. The task. She hesitated before stepping forward. "You did well today." Cross smirked. "Is that a compliment from the princess?" She rolled her eyes but did not look away. "You surprised everyone. No one expected you to solve the Maze of the Ancients." Cross sat up. "Wasn't easy, but I've seen puzzles like that before, ones that change patterns over time. It's all about understanding the rhythm." Zalvia studied him. "You understand things differently than us." He tilted his head. "Is that bad?" She hesitated. "No, it's interesting." Silence filled the room. For the first time, there was no tension between them. No expectations. Just two individuals, speaking as equals. Finally, she spoke again. "The final trial is tomorrow. It is the hardest of all." Cross nodded. "I figured." She looked at him carefully. "Are you afraid?" He grinned. "Princess, I fought a giant alien warrior and solved an ancient puzzle. At this point, I'm just curious to see what's next." Zalvia let out a small laugh, a real laugh. For the first time, she dared to think that maybe, just maybe, This human could truly change everything. And deep down, that thought both thrilled and terrified her. The grand hall of the Zorveni Palace was silent. The tension in the air was thick as the final trial was about to begin. Cross stood in the center, his expression calm but focused. He had won the trial of strength. He had conquered the trial of mind. But now he faced the most difficult challenge of all, the trial of heart. From the royal balcony, the emperor watched with his glowing golden eyes. His bioluminescence flickered slightly, showing a rare sign of deep thought. Around him, the nobles whispered among themselves, wondering if the human had any chance of passing this last test. Izalvia sat beside her father, her hands clenched tightly together. She had watched Cross fight. She had seen him think. But this trial was different. This was not about battle or intelligence. This was about who he truly was. The emperor stood. You have proven your strength, and you have shown wisdom beyond expectation. But no warrior, no ruler, no mate is complete without a true heart. Cross took a deep breath. What's the challenge? The emperor gestured, and the grand doors of the hall opened. A group of Zorveni attendants entered, carrying something carefully wrapped in cloth. As they unwrapped it, gasps spread through the room. A small, delicate creature lay inside. A Chiron beast, one of the rarest animals in the empire. Its scales shimmered in shades of silver and blue, and its large eyes blinked weakly. It was injured, its wing broken, its body trembling in pain. The Chiron beast is sacred to our people, the emperor said. It is said that only those with pure hearts can gain its trust. Your final trial is simple. Heal it. Cross stared at the creature. Heal it. But I'm not a doctor. The emperor's eyes glowed. This is not a test of medical skill. It is a test of spirit. If you wish to be worthy of a royal mate, you must show that your heart holds the strength to care for those who are weak and suffering. Cross slowly approached the creature, lowering himself to its level. The Chiron beast flinched, its tiny body trembling in fear. Izalvia watched closely. She knew that the Chiron beasts were highly sensitive. They could sense emotions, fear, anger, kindness. If Cross had even a single trace of cruelty in his heart, the creature would reject him instantly. The nobles whispered again. Some looked amused. How could a warrior, a fighter, possibly succeed in a test of kindness? But Cross ignored them. Gently, he extended his hand, careful not to startle the fragile creature. His movements were slow, his eyes soft with understanding. It's okay, he murmured. I won't hurt you. The Chiron beast blinked, watching him closely. It did not move, but it also did not run. That was a good sign. Cross took another step closer. He could see the pain in the creature's eyes, the way it trembled. He knew that feeling. The feeling of being weak, of being helpless, of being alone. And so, he did not rush. He simply sat there, patient and calm. Minutes passed. The nobles grew restless. Then, the Chiron beast moved. Slowly, hesitantly, it inched closer to Cross. It sniffed at his fingers, then let out a soft, weak chirp. Cross smiled. That's it. You're safe. With extreme care, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small piece of food. It wasn't much, just a simple ration he had kept from before. He placed it gently on the ground. The Chiron beast hesitated, but then it ate. Gasps filled the room. The emperor's eyes flickered. Izalvia's breath caught in her throat. The Chiron beast had accepted him. Carefully, Cross reached out and touched the creature's broken wing. The Chiron let out a soft chirp, but it did not pull away. He studied the injury and gently adjusted the limb, wrapping a piece of cloth around it to keep it stable. There, he murmured. That should help. For the first time, the Chiron beast did something incredible. It nuzzled against his hand. The entire hall fell silent. The emperor stood tall. It is done, he declared. His voice carried across the chamber, filled with authority and something else, respect. The nobles looked at each other, stunned. A warrior could fight. A strategist could think. But a true leader, a true mate, had compassion. Zalvia felt something warm in her chest, a feeling she had never truly known before. Pride. Cross had done it. He had passed a final trial. The Emperor stepped forward. You have proven yourself beyond expectation. Strength, wisdom, and heart, you possessed them all. The crowd waited for his next words. The Emperor turned to his daughter. The choice is yours, Zalvia. A hush fell over the room. All eyes were on her. Zalvia's bioluminescent markings glowed softly. She looked at Cross, at the human who had defied all odds, who had fought for her, not out of duty, but because he believed she was worth it. She took a deep breath. Then she stepped forward and spoke the words that would change everything. I accept. The room erupted into noise. Some cheered, some protested, but none could deny what had just happened. Cross grinned. Well, he said, looking up at her, guess that means we're engaged. Zalvia rolled her eyes, but she couldn't stop the small smile on her face. The impossible had happened. A human had won the heart of a Zorvani princess, and the empire would never be the same again. The royal chamber was filled with light and energy. The Zorvani nobles, warriors, and scholars had gathered, their glowing markings pulsing in different colors, some in celebration, some in frustration. The news had spread across the empire like wildfire. The human had won. Cross stood beside Zalvia, his arms crossed, but his face calm. He had fought, and he had shown kindness. He had completed the 3 trials, proving himself not just as a warrior, but as something greater. As a worthy mate, the Emperor sat on his grand throne, his golden bioluminescence flickering with deep thought. His gaze moved from his daughter to the human who had defied all expectations. The trials have been completed, the Emperor announced, his voice carrying across the chamber. By law and tradition, Zalvia has chosen her mate, but the decision is not just hers to make. Cross frowned. What do you mean? The Emperor stood, his glowing eyes fixed on him. A mate of the royal family does not only marry into the bloodline, they become part of the empire, and the people must accept them. Murmurs filled the room. Some nobles nodded in agreement, while others looked doubtful. Zalvia stepped forward. Father, you know the people will resist. Many do not believe a human can be one of us. Then let them see for themselves, the Emperor said. We will hold a gathering in the Great Hall. The people will ask questions. They will challenge. And if this human truly wishes to stand by you, he must face them not with weapons or wit, but with honesty. Cross exhaled. Another test. But this one was different. He couldn't fight or solve a puzzle to win. This time, he had to prove himself with words. The Great Hall. The Great Hall was massive, filled with hundreds of Zorvani citizens, warriors, scholars, workers, and leaders from different regions. The moment Cross entered, he felt their eyes on him. Some were curious, others doubtful, and a few outright hostile. He stood tall, knowing that this moment would decide everything. An elder Zorvani, his bioluminescent markings faded with age, stepped forward. Human, he said, his voice slow and deep. Why do you seek to join us? Do you wish for power? Wealth? Cross shook his head. No, I never asked for this, but I won't walk away either. Zalvia isn't just a princess. She's a person. She deserves someone who sees her as more than a title. And if that means proving myself, then I will. Some murmurs of approval rippled through the crowd. A warrior stepped forward next. You defeated me in combat, he growled. You used tricks, not strength. How can we trust you to stand beside our princess in battle? Cross smiled. You call it a trick. I call it strategy. If I had fought you head-on, I would have lost. I adapted. That's what humans do. And if I stand beside Zalvia, I'll adapt to protect her too, no matter what it takes. The warrior frowned but did not argue further. Then, a noblewoman stepped forward, her markings glowing bright blue. What if the Empire turns against you? What if you are rejected by our people? Cross glanced at Salvia, then back at the noblewoman. Then I'll stand my ground. I didn't come here to take anything from you. I came here because Salvia deserves the right to choose. And she chose me. A hush fell over the hall. The nobles exchanged glances. The warriors crossed their arms, considering his words. The scholars whispered among themselves. Then, a voice spoke from the back. It was a child. A small Zorveni boy stepped forward, looking up at Cross with wide, curious eyes. "Are you afraid?" the boy asked. Cross knelt down, meeting the child's gaze. "Yeah," he admitted. "I am. But being brave isn't about not being afraid. It's about standing strong even when you are." The boy smiled. And then something unexpected happened. He walked up to Cross and touched his hand. A soft glow passed between them, a sign of trust. The nobles gasped. The warriors looked at each other. And slowly, more citizens stepped forward. Some nodded in respect. Others hesitated but did not reject him. The shift was happening. Cross wasn't just an outsider anymore. He was becoming one of them. The Emperor's decision. Back in the royal chamber, the Emperor sat in deep thought. His gaze flickered between his daughter and the human who had changed everything. "You have done what I thought impossible," the Emperor admitted. "You have not forced your way into our world. You have earned your place in it." He turned to Xalvia. "You have chosen wisely, my daughter." Xalvia's bioluminescent markings glowed softly. She turned to Cross, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her eyes. "This is just the beginning," she told him. Cross smirked. "Good. I like a challenge." The Emperor stepped forward, his golden markings pulsing brightly. "Then it is decided." He placed a hand on Cross's shoulder. "Welcome, Cross of Earth. Welcome to the Zorveni Empire." The chamber erupted into cheers. And for the first time in history, a human had not just entered an alien world. He had become part of it. A new future. Later that night, Xalvia and Cross stood on the balcony of the royal palace, looking over the city. The lights of the Zorveni capital sparkled like a sea of stars. "Did you ever think this would happen?" Cross asked. Xalvia shook her head. "No, I thought I would be alone forever." Cross took her hand. "Not anymore." She glanced at him, then smiled. "Not anymore." As the stars shone above them, a new chapter of history began, and the galaxy would never be the same again.